a special guest. Deeph Chana is here at Imperial with us. The reason he's joined us is because we're having a discussion about Black Lives Matter with the HODs in the heads of department with the various other senior people in the Imperial, and Deeph spoke up for about 2 or 3 minutes and spoke articulately and thoughtfully about issues that can be challenging and difficult for a lot of people. And I just thought maybe if I asked really nicely, he might start. And I put on my best face, and he said yes. So that we probably need to get him back to talk to us again on his day job, because he's Professor of Practice within Imperial's Business School, Deputy Director of the Institute for Security, Science, Technology, and is co-founder of the UK government-funded research institute in trustworthy industrial control systems, and Imperial's FinTech network of excellence. And we have a lot of coincident interests in things beyond technology and science as well in areas. He has a deep background that I hope you'll hear about in areas associated with sustainability and conservation biology. So there's a lot of areas of resonance, a lot of things that we could talk with him about outside the particular topic of racism and Black Lives Matter. The way that we thought we'd handle this today is Deeph will give us some background about himself and his personal journey. And then we thought we would have a discussion between the two of us, between myself and Deeph, about our perspectives on how this influences one's career and one's opportunities in life in general. But we'll keep this reasonably brief. And what we'd like to do then is to encourage people to speak up and ask questions. And as Deeph said, ask any question. We can't be held back by any particular sensitivities we might have or we might think others may have. We should speak up and in an open and supportive environment, have a good discussion about this. In the end, to focus on things that this department can do over the next 20 years that would make a difference to things like racism and related phenomena like misogyny and other things as well, of course. So that is a preamble. I hand over to Deeph. Thank you very much, Deeph, for joining us.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for that great introduction. I told you my website was probably out of date, so I'm now the co-director of the Institute for Security, Science and Technology. So that's my fault for not updating my biography. But listen, it's an absolute pleasure to be with you all today to talk about this topic. Mark and I have had some very fascinating discussions, I think, since that the original HODS discussion where we started talking about this topic. And so, yeah, we thought this would be a good conversation to get stuck into, as I'm quite motivated to do that. So before I start with some of the things I wanted to talk about, I just wanted to say a few things at the beginning, just to sort of orientate the discussion a bit, and also for you to understand where I'm coming from. So I'm going to take a fairly biographical approach to this. So it's basically my experiences that I'm going to try and relate to you around prejudice and discrimination and diversity. And I guess as a result of that, it'll focus quite heavily on issues of race and racism, although this is really something. Race and racism, I think, is the vehicle through which we should have a wider debate around inclusion and diversity. So that's just the perspective I'm going to bring on it. And I should also tell you, this is the very, very first time in my entire career and in my life that I'm ever formally sitting in front of a bunch of people talking about this topic. And that's partly to do with something we could get into later on, which is really, I think, a lot of people's hesitation, particularly if they come from minority groups, to be defined by these kind of topics, to be defined by prejudice. And that's something which I think I've had a bit of a change of mind about over the last few years, and we could maybe have a discussion about that as well. So I'll just get into it and talk for the next sort of 10 minutes or so, and then maybe Mark will say a few things and we can get into some questions. I would also say the rules of the game are the following. I'm prepared to answer whatever questions you may have of me if I can. So please, let's just use this as an opportunity to just have a very open and frank debate. And I'll try on my side to be as honest and transparent as I can with my answers. It's a very complicated topic. And I realize that, I've been thinking about this topic for sort of most of my life. And so trying to do a talk about it in even an hour or even 10 minutes or in an hour session is kind of difficult. So when I started thinking about all the things I might talk about here, it very quickly became complicated. So I'm reading off a mind map that I made the other day around this, which I might choose to share with you at some point. But so let's start with where I started off. So I was actually born in Kenya, in Nairobi, in East Africa. My mother was a nurse, a senior nurse in Nairobi Hospital, and my father was one of the head wildlife vets for Nairobi National Park, and was heavily involved in the conservation movement in East Africa and actually around Africa generally. So we lived inside Nairobi National Park, and that's the touch point I think Mark is referring to. And so I was born in the mid-70s in Kenya. It was a very interesting time. Kenya had only a few years earlier really gained independence in the 60s. And there were many issues surrounding race and what was going to happen to the country in the future following its kind of colonial past. And lots of tensions between the various different racial groups within Kenya. But one thing which was really resonant for me from a very young age is that the colonial past and the racism that had been experienced in Kenya, particularly from the white population against the ethnic minorities or the coloured populations, was something that was kind of put into my head from a very, very early age. And I'll explain a little bit about that effect that it had on me later on in my career, my life. But it was always an undercurrent. There was always a background of this. And as you can imagine, that was probably understandable given the youth of that sort of newly emerged country. I have an Indian background, an Indian heritage, but my grandparents came to East Africa, were brought to East Africa through the British colonial system, when Indians were brought to East Africa to help with building infrastructure and all sorts of other things. And my family, and my father in particular, very much pushed us to have an African identity. We knew we had an Indian background, but his view was that we were Africans and we were Kenyans, and that we should view everybody around us in the same way. And that wasn't necessarily a view that was shared by people from different ethnic backgrounds, and certainly many Indians, I think, would have also had slightly different views about how closely aligned they were to people with darker skins and people with lighter skins. And again, this is something that was very, very visible, and actually in many ways I think probably still is in those countries if people admit to it. So as I said, race and racism was around a topic that was around me a lot. And from the conservation perspective, I think my father certainly had this view, which many of his colleagues shared, around the kind of European model of conservation, which they feel had been kind of foisted on them in some way. And so that, of course, created various tensions and discussions, and again, things we can get into later on. So when Kenya got its independence, it was interesting that many people had to make a choice between having a UK citizenship or a Kenyan citizenship. And my mother's family chose to have a UK citizenship. It was called an overseas citizenship, so you were not a full British citizen. My father's family, on the other hand, chose to take the new Kenyan citizenship. And again, this led to many interesting debates over the years within my own family. So that maybe gives you an understanding of some of my background in Africa. We then moved, when I was quite young, to Libya, and we lived there until I was about 10, 11 years old. And again, a whole different set of issues emerged when we moved to Libya. And in particular, we lived in a kind of a compound with people from various different nationalities, where my father was working on a conservation development project with the Kenyan government partnering with the United Nations. But as I said, we could probably spend an hour just talking about that. So these are just some touch points for you. We eventually decided to move to the UK. In fact, we were, I suppose, in some ways forced to move out of Africa when the Libyan government was accused of terrorism and was involved in some terrorist activities. And so everyone around us, we had Brits and Turks and Americans, and as I said, Syrians, people from all different sort of backgrounds and nationalities. Everyone was asked to. Well, everyone was not asked to leave, but I think it was it was a strong suggestion from their various governments that it was probably time to get out of Libya. And we decided to drive out. My father had a Volkswagen camper van, and we drove to London. And my parents decided at that point that going back to Kenya was not in the best interest of us as kids, and my mother was quite sort of committed to us understanding what it was like to live in the UK. Her family was already all in the UK, and she wanted us to be schooled here and actually to connect with this part of our lives. So we drove to the UK, crossed bits of Africa, a little skirted around the Sahara, ended up going through Spain and France, and then ended up in London. And that brought us to the UK, and I had to go to school in the UK for the first time. I had been homeschooled pretty much up until this point. And coming to the UK with a slightly strange accent and a background which didn't really fit in with many people was a little bit of a tough adjustment for me. And we immediately, on moving here, and this would have been in the sort of early mid-80s, we immediately, when we moved here, started being exposed to some fairly open prejudice and racism, which I think was, well, it was prevalent at the time. It wasn't really that hidden. So incidents such as having our garage door spray painted with, and you'll excuse my language, I apologize if I'm being so very blunt, but there's no point skirting around this. But we'd have things like Packies Go Home spray painted on our garage wall. Somebody tried to once light our car by putting tissue paper into the petrol tank, fireworks through the letterbox. My father would be shouted at across the street. He would retaliate, to be honest with you. He wasn't the kind of person to shy away from it. And of course, this caused huge amounts of tension internally in our home and also just with other people. And school was great in one way. We met, London was a fantastic place to be. I met people of all sorts of different backgrounds. But also the kids would play out some of these kind of racial tensions and these racial tropes in the playground. And of course, many times they didn't know what they were saying, but then again, that caused a whole different set of dynamics at school around prejudice and discrimination. I think growing up in London, one of the things which I think was very obvious is that the darker your skin, the worse things were for you. I have to say that. So my friends who I went to school with, I went to an inner London city comprehensive at high school. I'm very, very fortunate to be amongst a wide range of people. I have friends from all different backgrounds, of all different skin shades and nationalities. But it was very clear to us as friends that, if you were very dark skinned and what we would call, I suppose, and categorize as black, then you had real problems, and we had many run-ins with police in sort of pseudo stop and search scenarios. But also there was this kind of, it was very difficult, I think, for people not to equate negative stereotypes to black people, and there was always this big connection around assumptions of criminality and all of this sort of stuff. So we grew up in this kind of environment. Ironically, I remember at one stage a friend of mine at high school coming to me to tell me that he joined the British National Party, and somebody I knew quite well, and he said, "Oh, I've joined the BNP," and this was a kind of example of people telling you something like this, and then sort of saying to you, "Yeah, but you're okay. It's the rest of them that we got a problem with, but you're all right." And this was a kind of very normal scenario, if you like, that you would experience. And there was all sorts of other issues. I mean, many of my friends supported football teams. It was very difficult, I think, if you had a certain skin tone, if you were darker skinned, to support certain football clubs. It was well known that there was racism and discrimination that was rampant in certain areas, and that drove you away from supporting certain football clubs. One that's very close, unfortunately, to Imperial at the moment, didn't have a great reputation at the time, and that was Chelsea Football Club. And many of the London clubs had issues such as that, which pushed you away from it. And just moving on from this a little bit, I think what I can say is that going up through high school, it became very difficult to know how to deal with this stuff, because you would also end up with stories from your parents around what might happen. Many of my friends were children of people from the Windrush generation. Of course, we had huge amounts of Pakistani migration in the 1960s as well, where Labour was brought over to the UK. There was the Free Mandela movement of the 80s and the 90s, all of these things going on. And it was difficult as teenagers, I suppose, to decide whether to listen to a lot of the stuff that your parents were telling you, or what you'd hear in the family, which could be very negative, and also then the negative stuff you'd get outside. And I think a lot of friends of mine decided at this point that in fact we were going to try and own the idea of being British and redefine what that meant. And some of this was influenced by things like rap music that was coming out of the United States at a time where people were pushing the idea of owning kind of negative language, which at the time got a lot of criticism, but I think we kind of locked into that. And so a lot of us decided that we were going to kind of ignore, I guess, what our parents were saying, but also ignore the prejudice that was happening outside and try and redefine what it meant to be British, but also, I suppose, more in a more focused way for us, sort of own what it was to be a Londoner. And this became quite an important thing for me and my friends, and something which I think still sort of drives me today. If I just very quickly move on to my university and then life and then career after that, I think when I went to university, it was kind of interesting to go to a place where you would have assumed that people who had reached a certain educational standing would be more aware of these kind of issues. But actually, when I got to university, I found a lot of students and young people who were very, very smart and actually still good friends of mine, but who had very little street smarts, if you like, and had no real awareness of the sort of things that were going on. And in fact, I remember being asked very seriously and earnestly a question about whether or not I went to school with black people and what that was like. And choosing to do physics as I did, of course, I found that the diversity of the student body was fairly restricted. We didn't have many women on our course, although apparently we were told we had a pretty good year for that. So the gender diversity was bad, and the racial diversity was probably even worse if I think about it carefully. And during this time, of course, many of us were starting to form some of our, first relationships, serious relationships with girlfriends, boyfriends, etc. I remember one particular incident when I was walking through Trafalgar Square with my then girlfriend at the time, who was white, and being shouted at from across the street that I should consider myself lucky to be here. And this idea of considering yourself lucky to be here was something quite common. She was appalled by this, and then we had a long discussion about the fact that I'd probably heard that kind of sentiment before. And unfortunately, this sort of sentiment is very much related to the ideas that we see coming out in some places right now around the benefits that empire gave to the rest of the world, and how people who are non-white, I would say, have to sort of somehow be grateful for the opportunities that empire afforded them, and also for the opportunity to be in the UK. That is something which happens a lot. And I know I've talked a little bit too long now, but just to get to my career, because I know Mark wanted me to focus on some of this. I then, after university, joined the government. I ran the national security unit for the government. I was very interested to see how science and technology could be used for political purposes, particularly in national security, which I could see was quite a divisive topic. And going into the civil service, particularly in the higher echelons of the civil service, very poor diversity, very, very poor representation in decision-making circles. And in counter-terrorism and security, I encountered some horrendous levels of ignorance and racism. And of course, at the time, we were dealing with the Al-Qaeda threat. And I mean, the meetings I went into to hear and heard things about Muslims and Islam and the perspectives on that were so ignorant that it kind of often stunned me. And some of this resulted in some horrendous pseudoscience being funded around the time on behaviors and behavioral analysis and profiling, which is something I'm quite proud of that a few of us stood up to. We move on to Imperial, and then I guess, unfortunately, and this is maybe where I'll stop and we can get into it, we get into Imperial, and I have to say that, having been here for 7 years, coming back into the university sector after spending time in industry and in government, it's been very surprising for me to still see the levels of bullying, open prejudice, racism that I have seen just being shown throughout the organization. And I guess this is sort of what has motivated me to talk to you guys today. Brexit has been created a very sharp discontinuity, an uptick in all of these behaviors for those of us who are sensitive to them. And it's been interesting to see how COVID-19 has also now precipitated a more focused discussion around things like Black Lives Matter. But there is also now an interesting emerging return to the racism that we've seen before around discrimination of people from Chinese descent and origin. Mark, I'm going to leave it there. I've kind of done my mind map. There's probably way too much on this thing. I apologize for running over time, but I would just say one of the key impacts that all of this has to people when they experience it or when they have to discuss it is, of course, that their mental health and well-being, and that's an enormous topic. And I'm very conscious that what I'm talking about here is, there's a lot of negative stuff here, and my life is very full and rich, and it's great, and I have friends from a very wide range of different backgrounds. So whilst this is sort of my sort of biographical take on this, I'm actually representing the opinion of a very diverse set of people who I consider very close to me, who share these same sort of views. So I'm going to stop there, Mark, if that's okay, and hand over to you.
Wow, thank you very much. That was phenomenal. That was fantastic. I can't thank you enough. I wanted to sort of put some brackets around this initial conversation while people are thinking about questions they'd like to ask and discussion points they'd like to raise, by getting a perspective of someone who has not experienced this. And Deeph and I talked about this earlier on as well. We're in very similar jobs and in the same institution, and have a pretty similar perspective on a lot of things, as we've chatted about our stuff on things like the role of STEM, on the disadvantages experienced by women, on things like sustainability and the environment, on conservation, all kinds of things. And there's some wonderful stories in the background to some of this. But
yes.
In all of this, I wanted to make 2 points that I hope will resonate with people, with the people who are more privileged in their career trajectories in their lives, as I have been. And one is, I can recall, from the perspective of being in my 60s and looking back through my career, I can recall half a dozen, 8, 10 instances where there was a decision on a knife edge. Will they appoint me or not? Will I get this opportunity or not? I write to someone and they say, sure, I'll meet you for coffee. Just that instantaneous response. And I remember experiencing those and thinking, wow, that was lucky. Wow. I was lucky. And there's been a sequence of those events. And I know in my bones that if I had been any one of about 10 things, I wouldn't have this job. Yeah. Now, it doesn't mean I don't work hard, doesn't mean that I'm not, I don't love what I do and all of those things, but I can guarantee I would not have this job. And it's not just that I happen to be white and male. They're both, but they are really important things. I'm not obviously religious in one form or another. I'm not too short. I'm not overweight. There's a bunch of things I'm not. And if I had any one of those things, and I had that perspective. And so when the data started to arise in the 2000s about the sorts of things that lead people to have particular roles, and to know that CEOs in companies are taller, are slimmer, have more regular facial features than other people, that you think, this is so deeply rooted. So then I think about myself, and I wanted to just give you one more anecdote. I went to a conference, Washington, 2 years ago, and I do try with these issues to be as balanced and as open with myself and with others as I can. I remember going to breakfast, and it was a conference of 250 intelligence analysts, the sort of people that Deeph and I work with in our day jobs. And of course, there were military intelligence, CIA, FBI, and predominantly white in the United States. And we're in Washington, where a significant proportion of the population is black. And I came to breakfast, and I saw them from behind and in slight profile. I could see skin color and hair color, and I thought, oh, someone's helping set up breakfast. And I turned around, and they were one of the delegates. But my instant reaction was, my first thought was not, oh, there's a delegate, I'll go and say hi. It's oh, good, they're ready with breakfast. And that came to me unbidden, and I don't know that I could have stopped that happening. This is so deeply hardwired, though, that the unconscious prejudice that becomes conscious. And I do think, no matter what we do, we're all prejudiced. To deny prejudice is denial. And of course the trick is to be aware of it and to deal with it when it arises. Now, that's probably as much as I can say that I've had the easy ride in this. And
well, I think you make a really great point there, and I have to admit to you, I think you're absolutely right. To not admit your own prejudice is nuts, and I think I'd have to do the same thing, right? I mean, I think we've all. I mean, I know that I've been in a shop, for example, and assumed that someone is working in the shop, and I subconsciously racially profiled that person. Because of all of the background noise of it, and despite the fact that I've experienced it myself, and that might even be somebody who you might consider to be, in the same racial group. And I don't know if you've noticed from me even just talking about this, it's difficult to know even what language to use. I'm not really comfortable with the concepts of white and black and brown and all of these things. And I spent a lot of my life very much distancing myself away from it as a kind of irrelevant thing to talk about, and trying not to have it front and center in my mind. And I think we talked about this before, and just relying on the fact that implicitly through my own actions that would be enough to kind of challenge all of that. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, even doing that, the subconscious bias still comes in, right? Even trying to put that guard up, you're still involved in it. And you say you've had an easy ride of it, and of course you've. I'm not sure you've had an easy ride of it, but you're right. I take your point. I think there are of course advantages, and there are situations in which that things would have been easier or different for you compared to maybe someone like me. And it's not something I've necessarily thought too much about until relatively recently. But the point that you make about asking for someone to go and have a coffee and then having a chat with them about something. Even having the confidence to ask someone to have a coffee, to have that discussion, that's the point at which you might even create a problem for yourself. So you feel you can feel these issues, you feel the prejudice, and as I said, it doesn't necessarily have to do with race. But if you don't have the confidence then to go and do these things, then you're already in big trouble. So
if you happen to have several of these characteristics, if you happen to be black or non-white and female and unfortunately too tall or too short, you're really in a bad place. And if you get a job at all, you ought to rejoice. I mean, you must be extraordinarily good to have any kind of a career at all.
Yeah, that's true. But then there comes a point where you sort of start falling into disadvantaged groups that have positive action and all this other stuff going on for them, which I didn't talk too much about that, but of course we went through this whole idea of positive discrimination and positive action and all of these other things, which are all necessary components in this whole piece of how we try and change things, but they're not the final solution and the answer. And unfortunately what I think's happened is we've got caught. This is going back to the title of the talk, all talk and no action, is that we've created all of these nice processes and systems that we think are then the answer, but they're not. They're just a stepping stone to the answer, because you don't want a positive discrimination policy to exist forever, right? You want it to get you somewhere, and then you want to knock it out from underneath you, because
yes.
Yeah.
So the critical question for us then, and the one that leads us to our, I guess, the bulk of the conversation subsequently is, what should our department do so that in 20 years' time, if you visited us, you'd think, well, they've done something really good here. Do you have any advice?
Do you know what, Mark? I think you're one of the first people you are the first person who's ever asked me to come and talk about something like this, right? So and this is, as I said, the first time I'm actually talking about something like this, and I talk about all sorts of stuff, and I've not really talked about this. And I think one thing that we have to do is there needs to be a mixture of talk and action, and it has to be the right kind of talk. And surfacing these stories, maybe somebody gets something out of the sort of brief biography I've just given, but I think surfacing the stories of people and their experiences of prejudice, and it's not just about people who've succeeded despite prejudice, but it's people maybe on the other side of it who've been in a position, I'm imagining situations, rooms that you might have been in, where you've heard something prejudice said, right? Maybe something racist said, and then what do you do in that situation? That's a very difficult thing to deal with too. So I think if people can sort of start admitting more to this stuff and talking about it, then I think we start at least starting to reveal how we can navigate around these issues, and it will encourage people then to engage with it, and it will encourage a more diverse community to even come and participate in the department or think that they can get into this university. I mean, look, we've got this big new campus happening in White City at the moment, right? And that where that campus is, from that campus you can see Grenfell Tower. I went to school, my Inner London Comprehensive is just next door, is in Acton, right? Now, I know for a lot of the kids growing up in those kind of settings, in those council estates and places like that, they might look at somewhere like Imperial College, which is now just over there, and they don't necessarily see that as an opportunity. They see that as potential gentrification and a push out from the area. Now, we've got to solve that problem, right? And so there's got to be maybe a more closer linkage between the university and the school system, I would say, where we maybe go in there and we surface some of these stories there too, and create a better connection with the students and the staff to make them realize that these kids need to be told at a young age that their horizons and their aspirations shouldn't be, confined and constricted, because it happens at quite a young age. I think it's not when you're doing your A levels. It's already, a lot of this is already formed in your head before then. Yeah.
Well, so let's open it up for people to ask questions. You can either type them into the chat pane or raise your hand and we'll open up. But Zen Makuchis has already asked us, if you're running a major university, can you suggest a couple of main actions that you would take on diversity for impact? And so you've kind of answered that already. But Stephen Curry has a question.
Hi, thank you, Deep, for sharing your story and your your career history and experiences of university. I was interested in what you said, that both as a student and then returning to the university sector as a member of staff, after obviously having worked in government and in the private sector, that you were, I guess, surprised as a student at the lack of street smarts and whatnot, and the sort of, I guess, lack of progressive attitudes among some of your peers, and then the encounter with bullying and harassment and racism as a member of staff. I mean, do you think that the higher education sector is a bit behind the curve on some of these important cultural questions, or are there features of just the way that university culture is sustained and propagated, largely by a white male academy? Are there particular challenges for us compared to other sectors?
Yeah, interesting. So on my student days point, I would say that most of those conversations were really well-meaning conversations. Okay, they were coming from, there was no hostility, just genuine lack of understanding. I mean, you'd have to call it ignorance, but that's what it is, right? And it's what it was. And so I ended up becoming quite often tutoring people in stuff which I just didn't believe I was going to have to explain. But that's because I grew up in a London borough where it was just all happening. So you can kind of understand that disconnect. Coming back to university as a staff member, again, to clarify, I think I came back to university obviously with a set of achievements and probably a set of a kind of an air and confidence, which means that I don't necessarily see any of that coming towards me. So I've had it okay so far, because I've probably built my immunity and my methods, etc., to avoid that. It just doesn't happen to me anymore. What I've seen though is I've witnessed it happening, and witnessed it in my presence. And in some cases, what's amazing is this stuff happens when you're present, and people aren't fully thinking about the fact that you're there and that you might have a problem with it. So you're somehow in a strange way now co-opted into it, and this is a very strange phenomenon which I struggle to kind of understand, to be honest with you. Now, my universities are phenomenal places. Imperial is a phenomenal university for many reasons. However, in my view, the universities should be the leading organizations in our society where this problem is at minimal levels. But when you look at all of the statistics and you look at the amount of time, the decades we've been talking about this, both from a staff perspective, at all levels of staff, with all manner of staff, and a student perspective, we're just not moving very far. And so I think my disappointment is really around that, is being a global top 10 university with what seems like a kind of ancient problem which has just not been solved doesn't really square very well. It just feels a very strange thing. And so I think that's where my kind of frustration, I suppose, is the right word, or disappointment, is that we haven't actually moved further. But sorry, Stephen, you asked me something else there as well, but I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that more or less is. But do you think the private sector has been more agile because they're a bit more customer focused and they see their customer base diversifying, and so that's a driver for them that universities are less sensitive to, perhaps?
That's a great question. So I think, one of the things I talk about these days when I'm talking about diversity is that I'm not interested. I actually, that's wrong. I don't think it is necessarily the most effective thing to do to talk about diversity, inclusion, reduction of prejudice from a purely kind of moral standpoint, because it starts leading into this whole feel-good factor thing, and it's a great thing to do and all that, which it is. But it's far better and constructive, I think, to look at it from a logical perspective, which is when you want talent and you want excellence and you want dynamism and you want all kinds of views, then diversity of all sorts is actually what you want. It's just a purely logical perspective to drive towards. Now, I think in the private sector, that equates to strong companies and revenue, right? So there is a much clearer logical drive to wanting to achieve it. So your opinions, your personal opinions, etc., almost become secondary. You realise there's a logical reason to go towards it. I'm not so sure that in universities that same sort of pressure exists. If your student numbers are full, if your professors are publishing, and your reputation is still in the world rankings at the right level, what's the driver for change? I can't quite understand what it is, and it has to be a moral. It has to be to drive and to lead the societal debate, is what it has to be. And we've almost lost our way as universities thinking about that stuff, because we're kind of pseudo corporatized, right? And I say pseudo because we don't have the same revenue pressures as an industrial player, but at the same time, all of our metrics are around these rankings and money and stuff that comes in. But where's the value leadership? Just because we shouldn't be like that as a society. That's where the university should be.
Thank you. That was terrific. There's a couple of comments. One from Chetna says, thanks for sharing your story as a fellow British Indian. Your story from India to Africa to Britain and growing up in the UK with some racism heavily resonates. And
yeah,
you have a from a fellow Kenyan, Onesmus. Do you want to, Onesmus, are you online? Would you like to ask your question?
Is that Onesmus?
Yeah. Yes, we've met before, haven't we?
Yes, we have. How are you?
I'm good.
Good to see you again.
I just wanted to check how your choice of university were determined by your background, being an Indian, from an Indian sort of Kenyan origin. Did that have any impact when it came to the choice of university that you wanted to attend?
Choosing my undergraduate, or choosing my, as a student, or choosing for work?
Looking at it from a student perspective.
I would say to you that I never let it become a factor. I didn't. I just wanted to go wherever I thought did the best job for me. When I wanted to study physics, I had two criteria actually when I wanted to study physics, and one was to be, I I wanted still to sort of be in London and in the city. So this is one, I suppose this touches on what you're saying. I did want to be in a multicultural setting, and I wanted to be somewhere which was excellent. But I certainly, you know, I mean, I applied to places like Durham, for example, which would not have been as multicultural as what goes on here. And St Andrews, I think, was another choice of mine. So that would have been very different from living in London. But I never thought about the fact, I never let this sort of debate constrain my choice as a primary constraint, you know, to the actual value of the degree or what it is I was going to pursue. And then I think I carried that a little bit on through the whole of my career. In fact, I sort of switched it the other way around, which is if I knew things were excellent over here and I knew this kind of issue existed, more so I wanted to be in it. So that's kind of what drove me into security and defense, actually, to be honest with you, because we have very, very, very poor diversity statistics across the security and defense sector. And that's because people don't feel engaged with it as a topic, because for various reasons, it's not diverse. So it's a sort of self-fulfilling thing. So it drove me to move into it.
Yeah, it's true about security. My brother-in-law is with the British Army. He's Kenyan and a true Kenyan. But he what you're saying now really resonates from my conversation with him. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Onesmus. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. We've probably got time for a couple more questions. And Mike Tennant has his hand up, and Miriam Axel has also asked a question. Mike, do you want to go first?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, you're on mute.
Right. Hi. Thanks for that, Deep.
Hi, Mike.
So something that's particularly or becoming more prevalent in the university sector at the moment is this idea of cancel culture, where if you hold any sort of dissenting opinion, then you're immediately you're basically just not allowed to talk about it, and that's having some pretty serious consequences for our peers in colleges that actually do social sciences, for example, or humanities. What's the role? What role can we play to encourage safe experimental debate, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, could you give me, is there a particular kind of example you could give me about where you think there would be a problem, the sort of thing you're thinking about?
Well, I suppose there's some basic ones, just like LGBT, but I think that's a general cancel culture issue. We're in our department, when we look at interdisciplinarity, we have to take into account things like gender, things like race, and sometimes surfacing those is particularly problematic in front of students that either are predominantly white or are sensitive to these issues, and this idea of triggering comes to the fore.
Yeah. Okay, I see what you're saying. So listen, this is really, really tough, because one of the problems you have with any of these diversity and prejudicial kind of issues is that the first thing is that you end up with a lot of stored up debt as the topic isn't addressed. And then what happens is something snaps, and then it becomes addressed, and it becomes very, very vocal. And then in that situation, people who are on the other side of the fence who do want to discuss it and debate it can then get shut down very, very quickly. So if you're white having a conversation in front of a bunch of people, from a sort of black background, you might feel very intimidated by doing that in that environment, but you genuinely want to have the debate. And so what happens is I always said that this needle kind of swings very violently from one way to another, and it is something that we have to try and manage a little bit. And I guess we have to, you just kind of have to accept that's going to happen. I'm not entirely sure how you go about managing it, apart from just continuing to try and have the debate and continuing to say that, no, we are going to talk about it. Because I think one of the worst things you can do is to just dip your foot in the water and say, should we talk about this? And the minute you get pushed away from it, you say, okay, we'll stop talking about it. Then I won't go there. I think you've got to try and push the debate, because of course look at something like LGBT, right, issues, right? I mean, when I was growing up, again, this was a huge debate amongst lots and lots of friends and colleagues and peers of mine at the time. But that one of the assumptions you have is that everybody who is from the LGBT community is completely up to speed on LGBT rights or even cares about it as an issue, right? Okay, so they may be very, very uneducated about it themselves, or they may be very, very reactionary or irrational. Same thing can happen in any of these kind of prejudicial debates. So the perception that suddenly everyone becomes an agent, an informed agent about this thing simply because they're a member of the group is a bit of a problem. And that's why the debate is important, because they've got to be brought, those sort of people have got to be brought to a rational position in the debate as well. But I think it's tough to suffer those knockbacks. But it's a persistence thing. If I was to recommend anything else.
Great, thanks.
I mean, I hope that kind of helps. I mean, it's
no, definitely. Yeah.
I'm not advocating banging your head against a brick wall. What I'm saying is that I think it just takes time. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
There's two fabulous questions in the queue. Miriam and yet Benny has got a great one as well. But Miriam, would you like to go first?
I mean, just before Miriam asks the question, sorry, Mark, I would just say on that last point. It reminds me of this whole debate with David Starkey, right? That's a debate that's been happening over and over again. And there's a situation where somebody said they were challenging and they were challenging and they were challenging, and finally, through the debate, actually it took a long time. Certain aspects and features of his position became revealed fairly recently. But that's why you've got to keep talking about it. Sorry, carry on.
Yes. Exhausting, aren't they, Vic? Yes. Miriam, are you able to come online and ask?
Yes, thank you so much for sharing your experience. This is really interesting, and for opening this dialogue. I guess I just wanted to ask your thoughts about the name Imperial. I know that Imperial recently removed the mark. I know that there's been quite some move towards removing terms like master and slave in computer science. I guess I just wanted to know your thoughts about what could be done about the name and what that says about the university.
That's a really great question, and I know that the Geology Society is going through a name change as well. Yes, listen. I think Imperial. Well, it says it on the tin, doesn't it? There's a bit of an issue with the brand, isn't there? And I guess there are two ways that you can approach this, which is to either try and, retain the name, but to rehabilitate it very honestly and just say, look, we're going to be called Imperial from here on out, but from now on, it's going to mean this, recognizing that when it was founded, it meant that. I think that's one approach that can be taken. The other approach is to consider a rename. And I know a few years ago this was a topic that was raised. I think Imperial and King's College London were the two that were debated quite heavily. I think it is definitely worth having a conversation about it. It needs to be discussed. I think the worst thing that can happen is if you kind of sort of pretend it's not too much of an issue and sort of gently rebrand. I think actually these institutions have to just very honestly say, hey, look, this is what we were about. This is how it got started. We're going to keep the name, but we're going to say, okay, this is a new start for us, and this is what this name is going to mean from now on, and draw a very firm line under it. Either that, or as you say, rename. Now I can understand, reasons why you wouldn't want to rename, and there are then arguments about destroying history. We get very close to this kind of debate around tearing down statues, etc. But that would be my feeling about it, and I've thought about it quite a lot. But I would say there are only those two options in my book when I've thought about it carefully. I mean, I'll give you, the reason I say that is because when I look at, I was talking to someone from a very large UK company that makes things like shampoo and soap, right? And we were talking about the history of that company and how it was founded and how it became to be such a large company. And if I go on their website and I try and look at the history of the story of the company, it's all about, nice, fluffy sustainability and doing nice things in the world and everything. But the reality of it was built on the back of a lot of exploitation in Africa, effectively what was slave labor, and it became very wealthy off the back of that. Now, that needs to be somewhere. That needs to be on the site somewhere. It needs to be easy to find. It needs to be part of the identity if they choose to keep that brand. And in some cases, I would argue I'd want to keep the brand so I could keep the story next to it. because another good way of just pretending it never happened is just to rebrand, right, completely, and just the history gets lost forever. So I hope that sort of addresses your question. It's a complex one.
It's a great answer, I think. And look, we've probably got time for one more, although Roshia's also got a question in the queue and Paulina's got a comment. But Femi, are you able to come online and ask your question?
Yes. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Deep, for your presentation. I admire your mindset. You did mention when you're coming to Imperial, the confidence you had. So I was just wondering, I know Mark said you should recommend things that can be put in place and be effective in 20 years. But in this transition period, as we wait for the magic wand of effective policies, well, I know a lot of people tend to give advice to, white, non-Black people on what they can do. But what advice will you give to people of color to help deal with discrimination, explicit and unconscious bias as we await, that magic wand of effective policies and laws, especially within the academic sector, because this is our reality. And then I've got a second question. If you were to enact one policy at Imperial to tackle explicit bias, because there's a lot of work at Imperial on implicit, that's unconscious bias, but if you were to enact one policy to tackle explicit bias, what will it be?
Oh, okay. Very neat. Okay. Okay, to answer your first question on advice, my advice would be maybe drawn from something I was talking to Mark about the other day, something I've learned, which goes back to the beginning of the talk, which is I've always been very hesitant to discuss this topic in such a direct and explicit way. As I said, I didn't necessarily want to be defined and shaped by these kind of things. I took the opinion very early on in my life that I would just, through whatever success I could achieve, I might achieve, that would be enough. That the language, that biography, that story that I told you today would be enough. Well, actually not the story, but what I'd achieved would be enough to sort of send the message out, and I would kind of implicitly deal with this. So I never really discussed it directly. I've got other friends of mine who all they do is discuss it directly, and that's the main thing they do. I think my advice is there has to be a balance that's struck, and I realize that from my perspective, having a more direct engagement about it, doing the kind of thing that we're doing here today, is very, very important, as well as the implicit stuff. And my advice is that you've got to call it out when you see it. I think you have to call it out in a controlled way. Unfortunately, it's incumbent on you to do that as well. Not only listen to it and feel the pain of it, but also call it out and stand up for it. And also at the same time, just achieve, and through examples of what you do, inspire other people to sort of follow that path. Because I think if you don't have that balance, it's very easy to either completely ignore it. And, if you do the whole implicit thing, you can just pack it away in a box and not look at it. And if it just is the only thing you do, which is just to focus on it, then it can dominate you and you can just become completely consumed by it. And I think that's not a great place to be. So my advice would be to have the balance, and to seek people out to have discussions about it. So, if I can talk to anyone else about this stuff, I'm happy to do that. But you might have other people in your life, in your peer group, that you can talk to. And I would sort of go and have those debates and then figure out what practical things you can do after that to make a difference, either through the action of your own life or some other activity. And I didn't answer your second question, sorry, but the one policy.
What policy? What single policy would you enact to tackle explicit bias?
That's a really tough one, because I'm not sure. I'm not trying to dodge the answer. I'm not sure there is a single policy or set of policies that we could write down which would deliver the change. I think we've tried a lot of this kind of like put policies down, get formulas. We've probably got, if we collect all of the policies together for this kind of thing, really nice documents that we could write already. I think what we've got to try and do is to drive cultural change. And that is something we've all got to be co-opted in. And if there's any policy, then I think it would be to have the leadership of organizations filter that message right the way through, that actually, look, we have to drive cultural change. And by the way, I don't think personally, my view is I don't think you're allowed to pick and choose the prejudice that you'd like to opt in and out of. I don't think it's right to be a non-racist and then have a problem with the LGBT community and to have a problem with gender, or to be somebody who believes in gender balance, but then to be racist, and actually, it's not, you're all in or you're all out, as far as I'm concerned. And I think that's the other culture thing that we've got to discuss, because of course there are people who are on the wrong side of the race debate. They're victims of the race debate, but they are potentially perpetrators when you look at something like LGBT. And I think those things have to be really discussed explicitly.
But look, I wish we could keep talking for another hour or 2 or 3, and then continue to a bar somewhere. But we can't. Very unfortunately, and our time's up. Rosie, I know you've had your hand up, but I think we're just out of time. Paulina's made a comment about that we can all look at that provides us with some background material for student suggestions regarding things we can do. So we'll pursue this through the Equity and Diversity Committee, and I know that Answer's online.
There's an interesting post that Paulina's put up as well. And any other questions, Mark, that we can take offline? I'm happy to, we'll figure a way maybe of picking those up if people are interested in that.
Yes, absolutely. Your email is readily accessible through the university email list, as you know. That's how I tracked you down, and we can follow up with you. I can just finish by saying thank you so much for giving of yourself in this, your time and your personal history. It can only do good, and thanks very much indeed. And I hope we can reciprocate one day.
It's been a real pleasure, and thanks for the opportunity. And it should be the beginning of wider discussions and debate on this. Thanks, Mark, for sorting this out. I really appreciate it.
All right. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you very much.
All right, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.